So, historical memory is the way that human social groups use these narratives and interpretations of historical events and periods and places to inform their lived current experiences. It's shaped by all kinds of stuff, everything from interactions with other people to our education and public history, that sort of a thing. I think this kind of a thing has a lot of relevancy for the contemporary anti-capitalist left, and that there's a bunch of reasons why historians are in discussion about it. As the consensus around neoliberalism has grown a lot over the past 30 or 40 years, the historical legacies of 20th century anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist projects, especially for those of us in the West, have been kind of reduced to these hazy, piecemeal recollections that they sell us a history that has the revolution cropped out to varying degrees, so to speak. And so one of the problems we've been facing is how these huge parts of our current historical memory attempt to bury revolutionary imagination back in the 20th century, and that we, in a lot of ways, lack the ability to imagine more equal and fair societies, and that it's caused this sort of paralysis over time, and that all this really magnifies these feelings of loss and defeat. It's this intense and persistent left-wing melancholy. Okay, so when all this happened in the past, how did the left manage to figure things out and move forward? They took a look at their current circumstances, and they figured out ways to sort of reinvent themselves. They did so by sort of reaching back into history, pulling it piece by piece into the present as a way to make something new and figure out what to do next. What it really does is it just helps us remember that we've always made our own history, and maybe that a better world is still possible.
Final Fantasy VIII is a Japanese role-playing game that was released in 1999. One thing that stands out the most is Final Fantasy VIII's pretty sophisticated use of history. In this case, I'm referring to what they call the Sorceress War. 2 years of fighting between a series of city-states that's led by a growing military power, and this technologically advanced city called Esthar that's led by an autocratic sorceress called Adele, who, in drumming up this conflict, sought to bring this whole world under her influence. After years of fighting, Adele and Esthar were defeated, entering into a prolonged silence, aided by this veil of invisibility that sort of saw the city almost disappear into thin air. Such a redneck. With Esthar away from the public eye, their opponents, who reside on the neighboring continent of Galbadia, began to extend their influence by invading independent territories. They built prisons to house anti-Galbadian actors, indiscriminately and extrajudicially executed people who stood in their way. The developing guerrilla resistance movement that had formed to oppose their occupation. Another response to Adele's failed campaign for global dominance were the creation of these things called gardens, boarding schools that mix education and combat training to rear a new generation of soldiers to fight and oppose sorceresses. The game begins at one of these places called Balam Garden, and the students at this garden are training to become part of an elite mercenary force called Seed. The establishment of gardens, their students, these seeds as they call them, are very intimately woven into the history of Final Fantasy VIII's world. That's because many of the students at these gardens, including most of the central cast of this game, are orphans of the Sorceress War. The trauma that these characters experience, it stems directly from a global conflict that saw either the death or displacement of their parents. The main cast of Final Fantasy VIII is this group of uncertain, reflective, fairly anxious characters who, in spite of their abilities and their many talents, voice and perform some of their deepest insecurities. Throughout the story, they struggle with and reflect on their feelings of abandonment and loneliness, their inability to perform under pressure and live up to the high expectations they have for themselves, their failure to live up to the expectations of others and their perceived abilities and value, insecurities and coping mechanisms that emerge from prolonged bullying, their desire for human relationships and connectivity in spite of intense personal tragedy, attempts to perform a role that perhaps doesn't fully encapsulate their desires and their sensitivities. The main protagonist of Final Fantasy VIII, a character named Squall, really embodies this persistent melancholy. He reveals this through a series of inner monologues that sort of demonstrate his most intimate desires. His desire to be understood, to capture sort of like some sense of purpose, and his desire to be honestly left alone because, as he says, someday everyone will be gone and you're left with nothing, nobody, a miserable inevitability. We can really see that these feelings have embedded themselves within these characters, these sort of embodiments of their unstable environment, all because of the violence and the death of war. I mean, for a while, all we really see of their pasts, besides just, spare dialogue here and there, are these vignettes of Squall as a child, longing for this person that he calls Sis. We see this memory of his, but he can't really place it. He doesn't even seem to know who Sis is. It feels like that not only we as the player are sort of left without the personal histories of these characters, but that the characters themselves experience this kind of detachment from their origins, a disconnect that has affected their ability to cope with their present condition. And we later learn that for the developers of this game, this was an intentional choice. This is not the first time that these characters have met. They actually grew up together. One of the main party's most important combat tools, these things called Guardian Forces, or GF, have this really bad adverse effect of destroying your long-term memory. Summoning magic is very common throughout the Final Fantasy series in various forms, but Final Fantasy VIII is really unique in that summoning magic is actually incorporated into the consciousness of its user, and when that happens, it starts pushing out their old memories. These characters who have already been orphaned by this really horrible war have unknowingly been even further displaced, this time from one another. However, there is good news here. These anxieties, questions they're constantly grappling with contains the necessary context for them to begin moving forward with their lives, to begin moving forward with the story of this game. It turns out that memory helps them find their purpose, the path forward against seemingly insurmountable circumstances. In this collection of essays titled Left-Wing Melancholia, Italian historian and Marxist Enzo Traverso describes the ways in which the left has engaged with historical memory throughout the 20th century. For the contemporary left, especially in the West, dimensions of 20th century left-wing history have been reduced to this neoliberal historical memory that strips revolutionary moments of their reach and their impact, limitations on our ability to see the past for what it was. The defeat of fascism was largely because of this collaboration between liberal governments, not the result of anti-fascist opposition. The European uprisings of May in 1968 weren't these radical swells of revolutionary activity. It was merely about cultural change, the triumph of liberal expression, the contributions of colonized people who fought against fascist creep are marginalized in popular memory of these events. The result of the supremacy of neoliberal ideas and discourse greatly contributed to this orphaning of the left. We are deprived of our horizon of expectation without the means to use our losses to figure out what to do next.
New movements had to reinvent themselves, both their theories and their practices, in a world without a visible, thinkable, or imaginable future. This melancholia, however, does not mean a retreat into a closed universe of suffering and remembering. It is rather a constellation of emotions and feelings that envelop a historical transition, the only way in which the search for new ideas and projects can coexist with the sorrow and mourning for a lost realm of revolutionary experiences.
Traverso's book shows us that left-wing melancholia is part of this larger legacy of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist resistance. Traverso evokes German philosopher Walter Benjamin, who argues that not all forms of melancholy are buried in the ruins of the past, but that in fact melancholy can absorb and redeem these ruins.
Thus, in the end, this writer stands alone. A malcontent, not a leader, no pioneer, but a spoil sport. And if we wish to gain a clear picture of him in the isolation of his trade, what we will see is a rag picker at daybreak, picking up rags of speech and verbal scraps with his stick and tossing them, grumbling and growling, a little drunk, into his cart, not without letting one or another of those faded cotton remnants, humanity, inwardness, absorption, flutter derisively in the wind. A rag picker early on, at the dawn of the day of the revolution.
It can be difficult to look back on the 20th century and come out optimistic about the contemporary left's future. But if we examine the past, we can discover that we were not born in a vacuum, isolated from history, but that we are part of a legacy of individuals who recognize historic struggle. The collection and reconstruction of our historical memory represents the political intersection of mourning and hope.
This is a dilemma of world history, an either-or. The scales are wavering before the decision of the class-conscious proletariat. The future of civilization and humanity depends on whether or not the proletariat resolves manfully to throw its revolutionary broadsword into the scales. In this war, imperialism has won. Its bloody sword of genocide has brutally tilted the scale toward the abyss of misery. The only compensation for all the misery and all the shame would be if we learn from the war how the proletariat can seize mastery of its own destiny and escape the role of the lackey to the ruling classes.
Okay, I got it. So if I had to pick the most influential revolutionary thinker I had ever read, it would definitely be Fanon. He was a psychiatrist and a writer. He was most known for writing some straight fucking fire while working toward the Algerian Revolution. Fanon grew up on Martinique. This Caribbean island was colonized by the French around the 17th century. He's basically this middle-class kid, so he spent a lot of time immersed in French studies and French culture, that sort of a thing. One thing people born in Martinique could supposedly rely on was the idea that they were French. They were Frenchmen by virtue of their language and their cultural experiences and their education, that residing in a French colony had conferred them these benefits of liberty, equality, fraternity, that kind of stuff they talk about. Which means that when Fanon signed up to fight alongside other free Frenchmen during World War II, he found out that basically, oh no, you're in Europe now, so you're way too black to be considered French. And it changed the way that he saw the world for the rest of his life. As a psychiatrist, Fanon studied the effects of colonization, these very sort of intense social repercussions that it had on people, alienated them from their own environments, and how it was this driving force behind all of these kinds of unique neuroses and trauma. It set up this kind of racial hierarchy, this caste system that caused people to question their identities and doubt their place in the world, all this really bad stuff. And then in general, Fanon's work is a really good example of how the people in charge of our societies make the most marginalized among us feel isolated and melancholic by sort of setting the conversation. So they're able to basically make alterations to the historical narrative as needed, whenever it suits their particular ambitions, and always in spite of the effects that it has on people. If you look at the history of French Empire, when it was advantageous for the French to keep their colonies, they talked a lot about the duty of their so-called civilizing mission. The idea that they justify their colonial project because they're spreading Enlightenment values, and if people in the colonies would just assimilate, then they could further the goals of humanity by making people more European. When they said that they were civilizing somebody, what they meant is that they were making them French, which we know is in a lot of ways bullshit. After that, they updated this a little bit. We need to be there in order to bring them into the 20th century. It's all about as racist as it sounds. Then as the 20th century moved on, when people started using the word decolonization, you suddenly saw these French elites that are talking about how the march of the progress of history is toward decolonization. And you have Charles de Gaulle saying the colonial project has passed its expiration date. Decolonization is an inevitability. They also need to figure out a way to make kind of all of this line up in the historical record. So we start to see a change in historical memory that frames all of this as an inevitable example of progress. Basically using decolonization to gaslight the shit out of everybody and pretending like they didn't spend the better part of the 19th and 20th centuries scrambling to hold on to their colonies until it became better for them to let them go. So part of what physicians like Fanon were describing when they worked with patients subjected to colonial violence, it was a first-hand account of the inconsistencies in the historical record from imperialists and capitalists, and how they have a tendency to use this stuff to isolate people away from who they are and where they come from, and it's all in service to this kind of version of the story that always seems to work in their advantage. When the historical record doesn't suit the aim of capitalists, then all of a sudden those histories are altered, changed, they're made ambiguous, they're forgotten altogether, and this affects our ability to look back on the past in a useful and productive way. Because, I mean, I get it. Look, neoliberalism would have us think that revolutionary projects are shredded and buried in the 20th century, and they're hostile to any version of historical memory that would say otherwise, but we know that this is a load of bullshit. Because when we read left-wing history, we can see all these people, many of who at one point probably felt really isolated, a bit driftless, mournful for their projects that have failed, not really sure what to do next, and all of those workers managed to figure out some really innovative stuff to, start punching way above their weight. And they took on some of the most wealthy and powerful people in the entire world. So I guess what's so dangerous about this is that eventually we could decide, maybe I could do that too. Because I fucking swear it, man, the thing capitalists don't want everyone to figure out is that history doesn't exist outside of human consciousness. We also use and make history. I think Fanon said it best. The body of history does not determine a single one of my actions. Je suis mon propre fondement. I am my own foundation. We have agency. We make our own history. Even when the left's history is shredded up and buried in the ruins of the past, that we're just going to go dig it up. It's in this historical tradition of revolutionary movements that we're something of a part of. No pressure or anything. In spite of all the changes that we've seen in the world, and we at least can know that the future is presenting us with the same choices that other leftists have had in the past. It hasn't really changed. It's pretty straightforward. It's socialism or barbarism.